Okay, as promised, after the video on Marx on the main channel, on Then and Now, I'll share some of my own views here, starting quite broadly and then moving to what I think are some of the most common criticisms that I'd agree with, sometimes loosely, sometimes firmly. First, I'm not a Marxist or an anti-Marxist person. It's very comfortable up here on my fence, but I like to think that I'm not a dogmatist. I find Marx rewarding, interesting, useful in some places, and I find him wrong in other places. I do think, though, that Capital is one of the most important books ever written. It's often underappreciated for its insights about capitalism, rather than the conclusions people immediately take from it about communism and, the emphasis on the Soviet Union that we have today. Many people do appreciate this on both sides of the political aisle. Conservatives, from someone like George Osborne in the UK, the former UK Chancellor, to a conservative commentator like Andrew Sullivan. They acknowledge the validity and usefulness of many of Marx's insights. So, you don't have to agree with Marx to take much from it. I think it was George Osborne, it might be someone else, who said that if you want to understand how capitalism works, then read Das Kapital. That's coming from a capitalist and a conservative. So for me personally, I'm reminded of something Christopher Hitchens said. It was something along the lines of, despite no longer being a revolutionary, a radical, a communist himself, he still can't help thinking like a Marxist. And this rings true for me because Marx laid out, more than any other social thinker, how an entire system works that still, in many senses, holds up. But like all universalistic analyses, most readers will find themselves acknowledging the accuracy of central pillars while gnawing critically around the edges and finding lots to disagree with. In my mind, Marxism is a leathery old 19th century hard foot, and what follows are those little fish that eat the dead skin around the edge. You can still bite away, gnaw away at the foot, might change slightly, might come through in a different condition, but ultimately a foot is a foot, and so the central pillars of Marxism, something that I think is hard to disagree with. So, first, that foot. I think all of the central claims are powerful, mostly accurate, and still very useful. So, history as movement, true. Alienation as a powerful force, mostly true. The labour theory of value, I think half true. Competition as a force on wages, a downward force on wages, true. The squeeze on productivity being a central feature of capitalism, true. The historical force producing technological innovation, that's also pretty true, though as we'll see there are some obvious criticisms to this. A tendency towards industrial concentration and even monopoly, very, very true. So, before I'm accused of too much fence sitting with these largely true, mostly true, half true qualifiers, let me explain. First, all of those things I've just mentioned and other things Marx uses as analytical tools, all broad brushstrokes, a picture, a snapshot of 19th century capitalism. They're tools. Marx is looking at particular instances and drawing general concepts from those particular observations. As he was to explain, capitalism changes. His analysis would change with it if he was alive today. He would make adjustments. He was making adjustments and writing further volumes right up to when he died. And so, because they're broad snapshots, there are exceptions and nuances and differences and difficulties. And again, Marx was the first to acknowledge this. So what's striking is, despite all of that, how accurate the picture he drew still is. What I'll point to here are what I think some of the limits are and you can assume I largely agree with much of the rest. Okay, so first of the common criticisms, and these common criticisms are the ones I find most uninteresting. One of them was that Marx is a determinist. You hear this often. And another is communism has never worked. Okay, so the critique that Marx was a determinist, as I mentioned in the actual video, if you haven't seen it, go and watch it. I know it's long, but I think it's a really good introduction to Marx. It's wrong. The idea that Marx is a determinist is false. In Capital, he moves away from using any language of that sort. But it's also a boring criticism, I think, because the determinism versus free will debate runs through any subject once you get deep enough. And Marx was a deep thinker. In other words, it's not a criticism that's exclusive to Marx. None of us have any evidence to conclusively say that free will or determinism exists. I know that I have opinions on it, and I know there is evidence that you can bring to that debate, but it hasn't been conclusively decided. Anything you look at, whether it's psychology, economics, or science, or evolution, boils down to this debate. So it's like really going into the weeds, but the weeds of the entire earth when you're meant to be playing a football match. It's not a good starting point for thinking through what Marx is saying. That said, it arises through more interesting criticism, so you do have to get to it at some point, but I'll return to that. Another boring one is it's never worked in practice, communism has never worked in practice, human beings aren't equal, that kind of thing. There are debates worth having, obviously, about the failures of centrally commanded economies and Stalin and Mao's dictatorships, that kind of thing. But Marx spent about 90% of his research, writing and analysis analysing capitalism, not any hypothetical system that came after. He also didn't believe in equality, just much more equality than under capitalism. He believed in the social directing of the economy. So again, while these issues are important and should come up, and I think in some sense it was a big problem for Marx not to discuss them more, they're not a good place to start because, you know, they're kind of fringe. Marx is talking about analysing capitalism, what happens with capitalism. So where should you start in critiquing Marx? Well, Marx started with materialism and capitalism, so any useful critique should start there too. Okay, the problem with materialism. First, conceived of very loosely, I agree with the broader central thesis that it's material, it's resources, it's tools, it's access to capital, it's who has money, it's who finances what, etc., that matters in political debate and in people's lives. And in many, many cases, the majority of cases, maybe, that matters more than ideas, what's going on up here, what people are talking about. And so every issue you look at, from the etiology of mental health conditions to explaining why a revolution occurs to trends in the history of art, economics, material forces have huge explanatory force. They explain a lot, but it's not always the entire picture. Ideas, culture, the mind, they're all extremely powerful. And a little like the chicken and egg framing, it's very difficult to work out which influences the other. All of Marx's work, though, is predicated on an inversion of Hegel's idealism, that ideas are the things that are dominant, that create the rest of the world, that move people to do things. Especially the early work up to the German ideology. But all he does, all Marx does, is reverse this and say, no, it's not ideas that are dominant, it's material that's dominant. It's material factors, material life. And he does it with no real evidence or justification other than a general sense of the world as he sees it. He explicitly says, for example, my dialectical method is, in its foundations, not only different from the Hegelian, but exactly opposite to it. The problem, as I see it, is if you do this, if you say that the material economic base of the world comes through our senses and makes an ideational representation of that material world in our mind, it's hard to get away from a kind of one-to-one model of the world, a deterministic one-to-one. So we're just taking a snapshot of the world, and that determines exactly how we act. The input determines the output. That ideas are just mental simulacrum of the outer world coming inwards unidirectionally. Marx writes, for example, the sum total of these relations of production constitutes the economic structure of society, the real foundation, on which rises a legal and political superstructure, and to which correspond definite forms of social consciousness. In his book on Marx, Stefano Petrucciani says Marx's position only makes sense if we accept a materialistic and sensualistic framework postulating a clear primacy of experience over concept and of being over thought. Now, Marx and Engels do try to equivocate around this a bit with phrases like determined only in the last instance, but I find these kind of equivocations quite vague and unhelpful. They cannot get away from their foundational position that they are, of course, materialists. Like, this is undeniable. So, why does this matter? Why is it wrong? What are the consequences? Well, I think it's quite clear that material and ideas both matter, and they matter in a non-simple, non-linear, unidirectional way, depending on what it is that you're doing, depending on the thing you're approaching. Ideas matter, culture matters, language matters, literature and art matter. And anyone who's had a crazy dream or considered the difference between something like a postmodern skyscraper and a cave, or an airplane and a horse, can appreciate the power of ideas to change the world. The human brain is the most complex object in the known universe. And, you know, there's a lot about the brain wasn't known in Marx and Engels' time. And there's a lot about science and history that we know now that Marx and Engels didn't know at the time. For example, many historians today point to the power of story and culture in determining historical events and revolutions and movements as much as economics do. A libertarian lecturer I once had put it like this. He said, if Marx is right that everything comes from materialism, the economic base, the structure of the economy, and that because of this, capitalist ideology is meant to be apparently so powerful because, you know, money is in control and the rest of it, and the actual material forces that precede money. He said, then why is it that almost all university faculties, half the press, everyone under 30, and half the Cold War world were in fact anti-capitalist? It's hard to square those two things. It's a good point because you can ask it of Marx and Marxists themselves. There's a kind of contradictory position baked into revolutionary materialism in saying that materialist, capitalist ideology is all-powerful because it arises out of the capitalist base, while also claiming that Marxist theory is enough, and these ideas, culture, writings, that they're enough to inspire a significant enough number of people to overthrow that system. So if this happens, if capitalist is overthrown by people inspired by Marxist ideas, it's almost disproven materialism because ideas have overthrown the materialist system. Again, Marx tries to get around this by saying things like the weapon of criticism cannot, of course, replace criticism by weapons. Material force must be overthrown by material force. But theory also becomes a material force as soon as it's gripped by the masses. So, you know, it does play around with this a little bit, but I find the simpler answer much more convincing. Idealism and materialism are equally true. They're two sides of the same coin, matter and thought. And this has consequences for how the rest of Marx's ideas are framed, because this is how he speaks. This is how he thinks, because for Marx, materialism reinforces his point that the contradictions of capitalism, you know, the downward pressure on wages, the corporate concentration, excuse me, my throat's getting a bit hoarse. I've been recording all morning for the next video on the history of capitalism. But all those factors of capitalism, the replacing of workers with machines, the improving of productivity, etc., will inevitably continue and contribute to the collapse of the capitalist system itself. So his analysis arises out of his materialism. But if you acknowledge that ideas have power in the other direction, that ideas have power over the material world as much as the material world has power over ideas, you have to acknowledge that those very things that he's pointed to as the central problems can in some sense be moulded, remedied, approached, criticised, changed by culture, by laws, by rules, by things like minimum wage and safety standards, antitrust laws, and so on. So if this is true, it can be inevitable that capitalism can be overthrown. But worse for Marx, it can be reformed, it can be changed. It's a human idea that depends on people. And that if we change our attitudes towards it, it can be changed, and that its eventual demise can no longer be guaranteed. And if it means the capitalist base can be controlled by the superstructure, the ideas, the culture, and all the rest of it, that if capitalism can be managed, then all of the forces, and he uses this language, forces that Marx talks about, aren't real forces at all, because we can create, out of ideas, out of books and writing and thought, out of neurons firing, we can create countervailing forces that then mould those forces. So again, I'm not saying that this completely demolishes Marx's argument or anything like that, but I think it has to temper it somewhat. But, you know, like you said at the beginning, the core tenets of Marx's argument are things that I think are indisputable, and it's interesting to think of them in terms of forces like that, because those types of remedies that I just mentioned, laws, regulation, safety, changes to capitalism, antitrust, whatever, the forces that are turned back against them, that come from capitalism and capitalists, whether it's lobbying, politicians, whether it's money spent on capitalist culture, the manufacture and production of capitalist culture, all of these things kind of prove Marx's point that the forces that emerge out of capitalism are hugely powerful forces. So what I'm saying is there is another side of the picture that is underserved in Marx and Marxism that I don't think he adequately manages to explain, and often explicitly avoids. Can you explicitly avoid something? I don't think so, but he really goes out of his way to avoid. So ideas, culture, art, writing, laws, human life, human brains, I think they do matter. Okay, the next one, value, falling rates of profit, labour theory of value. And it stems from the same critique. The emphasising of materialism over idealism isn't just like vibes wrong. I think it actually explains many of the other problems with Marx and Marxism, especially with how he thinks about value and what value really is philosophically. So for Marx, value arises from labour put into an object. In other words, it's materialist. It's based on how much food and shelter and energy and resources goes into making a thing. And obviously this is true. If I sell you a seashell bracelet that I just whipped up that took me 2 minutes, it's going to cost you less than something that took the labour of hundreds or thousands of people to make: computers, cars, rocket ships, whatever it is. This doesn't seem to me to be controversial. And that's one of Marx's main points. I think it adequately explains much of how production and the economy works. But again, it might be a dominant part of the picture, but it's not the only part. Again, ideas matter, culture matters, preferences matter, responses matter, how people think about things matter. Take something like Nintendo. I think this is a good example of this. Marx argued that two pin factories, say, put Nintendo for one side for 1 second, two different pin factories compete over the socially necessary, in other words, average, loosely, labour time it takes to put pins together, to produce them, to develop them, to manufacture them, to distribute them, to advertise them, whatever. It's a pretty materialistic enterprise. And I'd agree here. And he talks about a lot of businesses in this way, but that's a very simple example. Today, everything we do is much more infused with culture than in Marx's day. In the 19th century, people just wanted cheap shoes and cheaper food and better homes and that kind of thing, more material stuff. But today, people's preferences for Nike or iPhone or a Mustang is much more cultural. In other words, it's based in ideas. Now, back to Nintendo. Nintendo is valuable not because of the labour gone into making it, or at least not just because of the labour gone into making it, but also because of the kind of magic, the cultural magic of the characters, the ideas, the music, the uniqueness. People love it for a reason that transcends the materiality of its production. Now, problem for Marx then is that if ideas are valuable, a lot emerges from this, that management, organisation, mental skills, imagination, intelligence, innovation, stuff in the brain, neurons firing, ideas are valuable, that people value them because they're scarce and special. You can value a set of ideas too. And this invalidates, at least a little bit on the edges, on the fringes, at least in some sense, the position that surplus value, that extraction of profit, comes only from the exploitation of the worker. Ultimately, you get to a kind of postmodern position that value is both subjective, it's in the head, it's how people think about what's going on, about their own ideas and other people's ideas and the things they make and all the rest of it, and it's objective. You know, value is determined by how much material, how much food, how much production, how much shelter, how much infrastructure has gone into making it. So value is made up of lots of different things: judgments, preferences, labour time, land, cultivation, how we get food, cultural beliefs, who we want to be like, what's exciting to us, what's sensational, what's in the body and in the mind, so much more. Value is such a complicated thing. Trying to reduce it to labour time is reductive. But so if the labour theory of value is wrong, the normative position that capitalism is exploitative just based on that is also wrong. And I think you can't get away from the fact that these become subjective value judgments, precisely what Marx was trying to get away from. What you can end up saying is the ratio of reward to the capitalist versus the worker is unjust, say. But this draws on subjective evaluations of what a just reward, say for an invention or merit or innovation, is. If anything, you get into ethics and moral judgments, you get into philosophy and ideas, you get into all the stuff that Marx claims he's not doing. Petrucciani, who is good on this, sums it up like this: we know only that the output is greater than the input, but we cannot say whether this surplus is originated in labour or capital, or if it even makes sense to ask what the source of value is. And it's an important point. It's never considered whether it makes sense to ask this question at all, because when you think about it, It's a meta concept. It's so variable. Value is, it's the most human questions. Petrucciani continues, the labour theory of values failure, on the other hand, does not necessarily imply an abandonment of the concept of exploitation. It does, however, force those who still want to employ it to come up with a new definition. In the attempt to do so by John Romer, for example, exploitation is redefined as the advantage enjoyed in terms of lower labour and greater income by that part of society which owns the means of production, an advantage they would not enjoy if the means of production's ownership was equally shared by every member of society. So again, pointing out there's another side to this does not invalidate the argument at all. It just brings nuance to it. I should also add here that there's a very good video called Value by Unlearning Economics on the Unlearning Economics channel. It's a really good introduction to this, so go and watch that if you want to know more about this. But I should also add an honorary mention to the falling rate of profit here, which to my understanding has, and by the way, there's a massive literature on this, I'm not an economist, but to my understanding, it's not been proven either way, although also my understanding is that it hasn't quite played out in the way Marx initially believed. The point was that the falling rate of profit would decrease because if value is only derived from labour, and as technology progresses and the amount of machines required to produce goods increases comparatively with work going into making the product from flesh and blood workers, and the machines replace those workers relatively, then the profit has to necessarily fall in relation to this as the labour force decreases in size relative to the stock of constant capital, what Marx called constant capital, in comparison to variable capital, which are people. So constant capital being machines, investment and infrastructure and so on. And so the ratio between these two things is going to change and the rate of profit is going to reduce with it. David Harvey writes here, for example, that there has to be an astonishing increase in the ratio of the total stock of constant and increasingly fixed capital in relation to the number of labourers employed. But again, this relies on the labour theory of value being correct, and value not always coming from the ways that factories, machines, culture, art, packaging, logistics, all of the ideas organised, implemented with different ideas, with different approaches to it that come from the brain, come from neurons, come from, just realise that neurons and brains are not good terminology here because that's looking at the material. I'm talking about mind and ideas rather than brains and neurons. I'm talking about the stuff that sits on top, the software, not the hardware. But again, the point is that how you think about how to organise a business, how to advertise, the bureaucracies, the culture, how to paint it, all of the different thinking that goes into making a product. Then again, you have to acknowledge that profit comes from other things rather than just the ratio between the workers and the rest of the fixed capital in the economy. But I think it also misses that Marx underestimated, and I use this word very cautiously, underestimated, because you should never underestimate Marx's ability to correctly estimate. There's always some footnote somewhere deep in, volume 3 of Capital or something. But I feel like he probably underestimated, like everyone alive at the time would have done, just how much technological change was possible, how much would keep on going, and how the developments in technology would create lots of new areas of work. So there's a lot of that fixed set of capital would have new bubbles of workers to turn to, in new industries. Think about something like Photoshop. Obviously, didn't put artists out of work. In fact, it created a new subset of artists. So once again, materialism means he may have underestimated the extent of what we now call something like knowledge work. Machines don't just replace workers statically, linearly. Machines create new jobs, machines create new ideas, new developments for people to work on. So the constant capital in the machines continues to get cheaper, correcting for the balance between the labour force and the rest of the investment. Okay, another one, communism, rationalism and the state. Again, I think this is in some sense related to Marx's materialism. Tell me in the comments whether I'm reducing everything to his emphasis on materialism too much. Marx was in part, I think, a closet rationalist. Rather than the chaos of the market, he believed production could be more harmoniously planned. It's why he wasn't an anarchist. He believed anarchism would replicate the same competitive dynamics, the same competition between capitals, different capitalists, as under capitalism. And even if you believe that the economy should be run more democratically, something I do believe, there's no good reason to believe that the same issues wouldn't in some sense be replicated elsewhere. For example, in political competition for resources, in competition between cooperatives and so on. Okay, a couple of examples of what I think are some of the complications here. One, for example, is that Marx believed that if you democratize the economy, you put it in the hands of the workers, the state would wither away. But what about issues not relating to production? You still need some kind of organization to manage roads and train lines, and water pipes, electricity grids, ports, airports. You still need steel companies, farming regulations, and these are kind of national or at least regional or continental. You still need politics on that level. And if that's the case, you'll need representatives in some sense. And so when you look into the literature, the only difference between anarchists and Marxists here, not the only difference, but a big one in this regard, is that anarchists argue representatives can be recalled at any time, that's a principle of power and democracy. Otherwise, you're giving away power over you. But this isn't feasible. You need to give elected officials a chance to understand the issues, to put their plans into practice, to do things, or else you have constant recall. You have constant electoral chaos. In short, you get something that looks suspiciously like electoral representative democracy. So Marx, I don't think, can explain why just because you remove these issues from economic life, you don't replicate them in democratic, political, representative life. They're still going to be there in some sense. Contradiction, argument, discord is a part of how we all see the world and how we do politics. You'd still get a lot of the competition between factions, the disruption, the differences of ideas, just displaced from the economic to the social to the political realm. So there might not be competition by owners of the means of production to squeeze wages, for example, but the underlying logic of pursuing greater efficiency would remain. And so is competition not a part of how humans see themselves with each other? Not necessarily harsh, demonic, racist to the bottom, but in some sense looking to the next person, trying to do things better. In a centrally commanded economy, or an anarchist or a worker-run one, I know I'm doing too much conflating and generalizing here, but I think it's okay for the purposes of this video. There would still be incentives to reduce costs, to climb the bureaucratic ladder, to compete with a colleague, or to promise something to a professional acquaintance, to try and get ahead in some sense, leading to the same kind of forces and incentives that you find in capitalism, again, just replicated somewhere new. I just remembered that Ursula Le Guin's The Dispossessed is a great meditation on this wonderful novel about that thinks about, you know, the differences between anarchism, capitalism, communism through a science fiction lens. Great book. So the connected issue to this is that big entities like corporations tend to concentrate and centralize because of economies of scale, because it's cheaper and more efficient to produce steel, for example, on a huge scale. On the other hand, when there's no competition, prices get jacked up and consumers and workers suffer. So what happens when it's better to have a huge organization on a national scale, but that also this distorts price signals? The obvious solution here is to democratize a big organization or company or institution or process in some way, but it's still a monopoly. It's still a big commanding edifice. It's still a big thing to worry about. And you need some way for people to come in through the edges, for freedom to not have to be under the control and sway of that giant organization, that institution. Again, whether it is democratically run, whether it's a capitalist enterprise, or whether it's a state-run Stalinist still corporation, it's still a David versus Goliath thing, and you still get this sense of a big conformist organization. And so freedom against that thing, whatever it is always going to be a question, is always going to be, in some sense, a problem to think through. And again, I'm not saying this necessarily invalidates what Marx is saying, but I think it adds a bit more relativism to it, a bit more nuance to it, a few more questions to the alternatives to the system that we live under. And I think one of the problems here is that these are all kinds of issues that Marx avoided by not articulating what he meant by communism. If you get rid of markets, you infringe on freedom to associate with one another, to exchange the things you care about, what you think is important with whoever you want in the world. That's one thing that liberalism does very well. Does anyone really want publicly owned cafes and hairdressers and shops everywhere? No, of course not. And most Marxists will say that's not what we're talking about, or what Marx was talking about either. He's talking about the big industrial economy, which is fine, but you still get the same problem. Do you ban small competitors opening? The new person who has some disruptive method? Why would a worker-controlled institute be any better here? And if you do ban it, if you say no, it's going to be run only by the community, only by the organisation, by the workers, by the politics, then you essentially have a centrally commanded economy, and you're banning, you're removing, restricting freedom, telling people what they can and can't do. And to my mind, it does not seem like a good thing. And if you say no, that this isn't how it would work, you'd acknowledge competition and freedom in some sense, and then you'd return to the forces Marx laid out. All of these issues Marx avoided commenting on, and I wonder whether, he obviously wasn't stupid. I wonder whether this is why, because he knew they were too difficult. Maybe he feared. Okay, there are two more issues worth commenting on here that I'm a little bit more torn on personally. They're somewhat connected. First is Marx's view of history, and second, related, his view of alienation. Take this quote from the Communist Manifesto. He says, "The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles, freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guildmaster and journeyman, in a word, oppressor and oppressed, stood in constant opposition to one another." Okay, let's meditate on this quote for a moment. I'm very sympathetic personally to the Hegelian view of history. However, the idea that all of history is the history of class struggle is very, very difficult to justify. You can make that claim in Marx's time a lot more confidently. Today we know a lot more about history, and it's been disproven in a lot of cases. Marx believes the proletariat being materially squeezed into revolution is backed up by history. It's historically determined. Just to point to a few obvious problems with that, the slaves didn't overthrow the Romans or the American plantation owners, nor did serfs overthrow lords. Neither was the French Revolution a simple tale of the bourgeoisie overthrowing the aristocrats of the ancient regime, history is not that simple. Marx's framework here, as much as he likes to try to move away from it later on, is inspired by his early view of alienation, that if a social system estranges and alienates a part of us or a group of people, it will attract the ire of that part of us or that group and will, throughout history, be overthrown. In the 19th century, this might have looked persuasive. I think less so today. Alienation is a useful concept. I've always found it interesting and useful, but again, it's limited. Under modernity, to take one obvious example, we have to alienate a part of our existence to exist, because the world is just too complex. We need lots of different specialists, for example. We need representatives. We can't understand or do or be involved in everything. Whereas in Hegel and Marx's day, one person could still just about probably understand the totality of the world's knowledge or a political system and understand how it all fits together. You know, science was still relatively simple, manufacturing was still relatively simple, and all the ideas around them were still very clearly connected in this kind of Newtonian system building way. Today we have, you know, string theory and relativity and neuroscience, and you get my point. Modernity means we have large institutions out of our control, out of the community's control. And so in some ways, modernity is inevitably alienating. In other words, there's no guarantee that any other system will be any better at preventing that alienation that comes with modern life, that comes with all this technology and different ways of thinking and approaching and understanding and navigating a global world. But the critique that capitalism turns the worker into what he called a crippled monstrosity or a fragment of his own body because of the division of labour, I don't think that's just the consequence of capitalism, but of modernity. Again, the plane example, the aeroplane example might be a good one. You could be a worker working on the mechanics of a single screw in the wheel of a plane. That might be your only job. You might not be interested in politics. You might get paid a wage for it. You might not, you know, you're unlikely to own Boeing, for example. But because it takes that much focus to get right, because you have to understand engineering and you're fascinated by it, you still know and learn about the wider project. You don't necessarily feel alienated by it. Or take a train network, something expanding very rapidly in Marx's day. They were becoming the first vast modern bureaucracies, having to manage thousands of miles, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of miles of tracks and stations and routes and ideas and employees and all of the rest of it. If you're a worker during that period, you could just about imagine a world where all of the workers could, given the time, will, education, resources, learn about steam engines, iron and steel production, the engineering, the management of the network, then organised to run it democratically, each understanding and contributing to its development in a non-alienated way. But as technology progresses, this becomes increasingly difficult. You can't avoid it. Some people say Marx is not talking about alienation in this way. He's talking specifically about economic alienation, but I think this avoids the fact that alienation is a complex idea and its roots come not from economics, but from people and philosophy. And I think it's valid that you can consign and compress alienation to mean this very specific thing, if you want to talk about that. But that doesn't change the fact that, you know, just because you might be unalienated economically and be part of the democratically run economic system doesn't really change what alienation means and feels like and the history of it and why it moves us, why it affects us. Those things have to be considered. So yeah, alienation is a difficult, imprecise concept that's changed over time. On the other hand, if we look around us today, lots of people feel very alienated, self-reportedly so, by lots of different things. The economy, work, relationships, social media, but people find ways to overcome it. And so it's not just a capitalist, communist, socialist thing. It's a thing that affects us in lots of different ways. Take my partner, she loves her job because they focus on it being a good communal place to work. Community and meeting friends and being outside, all of those things are a good cure for something like being alienated by too much screen time. Having an economy you feel connected to is clearly better than not being connected to it. I still hold out hope that eventually the internet will be used as a tool to address some of these problems, whether it's in more localism, direct democracy, devolution, being more connected to the community in a really substantive economic way that matters. If you're interested in and have something to contribute to local politics, there should be mechanisms for you to be able to contribute, to be part of it, especially if we think democracy matters, which obviously Marx did. He was not just an economic thinker, he was clearly a democratic thinker. So alienation is useful, and it does drive us to do certain things, to do better, to overcome certain things. And I think if alienation reaches a critical mass in society, it pressures enough people to force some kind of historical dialectical change, and often that comes from the material base, the economics, how people feel about the economy, the material conditions of their life. That's not the only way we can think about alienation. The problem is Marx believed he'd analysed how and where those pressure points will come from, and there are lots of different pressure points too. People think about alienation in lots of different ways, not just in a material economic way. I think the history of alienation shows this, and people's complaints, how they feel about alienation, how it's talked about today, show this too. So again, the way Marx is inspired by and uses the term, I think, is still a really important way of thinking about it, but not the only way. Okay, to conclude, in all of this, Marx was a very modern thinker. I mean modern in a specific way, in the sense that he was a Newtonian, a Darwinian. He believed the laws of the universe and human life and economic life could be quite neatly, universally understood, that the laws of how humans thought could be uncovered, like the laws of physics could be uncovered. There are some flashes of the postmodern in him that complicates this picture, but he was still a modern system builder. David Harvey talks a lot about the complexity and the dialectical nuance and the dancing of Marx's work, making it not determinist, making it not systematic, not a rigid dogmatist, a system builder. And in a sense, I do agree with this. Marx would be the first to update what he was saying if he came back and was writing it today. But Marx is also pointing to what he thinks are the universal systematic laws of capital and the laws of history. You cannot avoid that. There's a line I find very interesting. Marx himself complained of those who tried to turn my historical sketch of the genesis of capitalism in Western Europe into a historico-philosophic theory of the general path every people is fated to tread, whatever the historical circumstances in which it finds itself. It's an interesting passage because it reveals some of the problems with Marx, and it's another passage where he's trying to equivocate and have it both ways. But in saying what he's saying here, he's humbly declaring that his own theory can be made obsolete in a decade, in a century, in another continent, that it'll change over time, that it's not generalistic, universalistic. And so, in a sense, I disagree with what he's saying about himself here. He did want to describe the laws of capital in the same way Newton and Darwin described universal laws. And I actually think he was right about them. He was right about them being universal, but it's a difficult kind of universe. It's got a kind of universal core that exists, but can be changed around the edges. Much like gravity, I suppose, is a universal core pulling at mass, but that doesn't mean you get perfectly spherical planets or objects. Like, things change, things are different. There are other forces acting on them too. And these universal forces that Marx described, downward pressure on wages, problems with competition between capitals, the tendency to concentrate, the difference is that the way they're tackled, problem with them is that they're universalistic at the core in a materialistic sense, but the ways they're tackled is ideational, cultural, changes across history. That's what molds them too. I think Marx and Marxists leave out this other side of the picture to their detriment. But there's no reason to be scared of it, because that's an important part of human life, and it will only make our analysis of the problems of capitalism fuller, more useful, more predictive, and give us insights into how those problems could be addressed. I'll leave it there for now. Let me know what you think in the comments. So, to summarise a little bit, do I think the gist of what he was saying was right? Both yes and too soon to tell, because the crises and contradictions of capitalism keep on going. Do I think that capitalism will be replaced by something else? Yeah, historically, you look at what happens, then I think it's more than likely. But I believe in kind of a expanding circle of freedom, which was the basis of both Hegel and Marx, that I think drives history, and that's why alienation is influential and important in history. People want more freedom, and it's working out a system that can provide for that. Can you outline how that will happen from an observation of how capitalism happens? And will it happen in the way Marx predicted? I think that's looking unlikely. But as I said, these observations are incredibly insightful, still resonant, still matter. And I still think Marx was one of the most important thinkers in history, but ultimately we still have work to do. See you next time.